Hello to those of you watching and viewing this recording. I'm Ralph Johnson, and I am the immediate past president of the Council for the Advancement of Standards in Higher Education, better known as CAS. And I have the pleasure this afternoon of interviewing one of our past presidents, Dr. Gavin Henning. So Gavin, would you introduce yourself and just tell us a little bit about your background, and then more specifically, how did you become involved and connected with CAS?
Yeah, well, Ralph, thanks for the invitation to talk a little bit about CAS and my experience in CAS. So I'm Gavin Henning. I use he, him, his pronouns, professor of higher education at New England College, which is a small private liberal arts institution in central New Hampshire. I direct our 3 Doctor of Education programs, as well as our Master of Science in Higher Education Administration. And I also direct our Center for Innovation in Teaching, Learning, and Scholarship. And I got it connected to CAS actually when I started doing student affairs assessment back in the late 90s. And so when I worked at, directed a division of student affairs assessment and did the program review, we used CAS for that, to assess the overall functional areas. But specifically getting involved with the CAS board, I became an alternate director in 2010 when Marilee Dunn left as the ACP alternate director. And Susan Comavez nominated me to the ACP governing board to serve in that role. And they approved that nomination. So I began serving in the alternate role, took up a little bit more of leadership role when Susan became president of CAS. So I was then kind of responsible for disseminating some information to ACPA, and then just continued my involvement past that.
Excellent. And that's been since what year?
Uh,
20,
in terms of when
2008?
I became the alternate director in 2010.
2010. Okay, excellent, excellent.
So I think when Susan was still the president, she was still the director, I think, but or the ACPA director, but I kind of did most of the liaisonship with ACPA so she could focus on that role.
Oh, excellent, excellent. So why is CAS important to higher education?
There's so many reasons, Ralph. You know, the obvious one, they're standards for practice. And so they really help student affairs professionals know what they should be doing in each functional area. You know, and many folks really think it's about the pinnacle and what we really all should be doing, the highest expectation, but they're really the kind of, these are the basic things that functional areas should do. Because CAS wants to make those standards applicable to all institutions, you know, to a small private tuition-driven institution like my own, or a large state institution like the Ohio State University. So regardless of the size or the type, those standards should be applicable. But in addition to that, CAS provides a self-assessment guide. So really identifies the process for doing a self-assessment for a functional area. You know, it's one thing to have the standards. It's another thing to actually do some assessment to assess the extent to which a functional area actually achieves those standards. And then I think the other thing, because there's so much attack on the defunding of student affairs units and divisions, it really provides some leverage for defending and advocating for resources. You know, folks, particularly faculty, some administrators, and certainly state legislatures don't really understand the work that student affairs does and how important it is, particularly to student success. So what happens is that when there need to be cuts, it's typically in student affairs areas. But the standards and the use of the standards and assessment towards those standards can provide some leverage for vice presidents of student affairs or directors of functional areas to advocate for resources or defend the resources they have, especially when there are elements within those standards about how many staff members should be here or how many hours we should be supporting. So that provides some concrete evidence to actually to advocate for resources and defend the resources those units might have. And then finally, I think it's a great educational tool. You know, as a faculty member, I use the CAS standards not just to help students understand assessment, just really help them understand functional areas. Many of them are new to functional areas beyond what they may have been involved in as a student, either as an RA in residence life and student activities as a student organization president. You know, we can use the contextual statements and the standards themselves to help educate students about this is what happens in these functional areas, particularly the ones they're really not aware of at all. And so there are multiple purposes and multiple needs for using CAS.
Right, and it's interesting that you say that, because one of the things that CAS has started doing is a presentation at conferences on the multiple uses of CAS, so that individuals will have a better sense of the wide range of possibilities for using those resources.
Yeah,
Now,
yeah, I
I
think
heard you
that's
say
great.
something. Yeah, absolutely. I heard you say something critical here. You said that we often refer to the CAS standards as best practices, but in actuality, they are the minimal things that
Yeah.
organizations should do. Tease that out a little bit for those who may think that these are best practices.
Well, and I think that's what we think about. A lot of standards are really that's we should be reaching high. But as I mentioned, the CAS standards really provide that foundation about what should every functional unit do, regardless of how many staff are in that unit, regardless of how much money is in that unit, regardless of what institution it's in or where they are geographically. It really is. These are the minimal things we should do to help support student learning, because that's really the ultimate goal of the CAS
Right.
standards is help support student learning, development, and success. And sometimes I think we kind of forget what that end goal is. But if we don't have, a certain number of staff, where we don't engage in these certain practices, we're not going to be able to support student learning and development. Now there's some guidelines in the CAS standards where people want to kind of step up their game a little bit. If they have more resources, they can achieve some of those higher level things. But the standards themselves really are like, this is the starting point. This is
Right.
really what everybody should be doing.
Okay. So you talked a bit about how you've been involved with CAS, how you've contributed within the CAS Council, but talk a little bit about how you have actually used some of the standards in your own work across your
Yeah.
career.
Well, I coordinated student affairs assessment at two different institutions. So we use the CAS standards for program review, but I've also done a lot of consulting. And so at a couple of different institutions, we've actually pulled together pieces of different standards and different parts of the general standards to actually do division-wide step evaluation. So there are multiple ways to do that. You don't just need to use the standards from a functional area in and of themselves. You can kind of pick and choose and pull together and put together a more maybe a more customized
Uh-huh.
set of frameworks that are really helpful. And so I think there's the element of using the standards to help people think about what you need to do, but also to assess those. I've got colleagues who I've actually presented on CAS in the past who actually use the standards to create new offices.
Mhm.
One of my colleagues, Heather Shea, when she was at Michigan State University, she had to create a women's center. And she's like, I'm not sure what I need to do. And so she went to the CAS standards, say, she could probably pull some ideas together, but what are the expectations? What is the field saying? Because the CAS standards are developed, revised, and approved by the entire council. So, multiple, close to 40 plus organizations. So it really is the entire field. So that's another way that folks can use the CAS standards. The other thing that I've used it for is actually using the learning domains and dimensions. So when we think about helping units or even a division look at learning outcomes, I provide that as one framework. So we can look at various learning taxonomies, or we can look at the CAS learning domains and dimensions, take a look at what is a framework for developing learning outcomes for your entire division, and then having different units talk about which ones do they support and how they do that. So that's really helpful with strategic planning. And now we're seeing this huge movement to curricular models within student affairs, and curricular models in student affairs need learning outcomes. So the CAS learning domains and dimensions provide a good framework for those curricular models.
So Gavin, you served on the council for a number of years. You're one of those long-standing members that we're very rare these days.
Yeah.
And I know that you've seen a number of standards introduced into the CAS
Yeah.
groupings, but identify one or two that stand out that were actually created while you were on
Yeah.
the council and or served as president.
Yeah. So I think the one thing that I'm maybe most proud of is the creation of the Indigenous Student Program standards,
Yes, right.
because we're really trying to understand and think more about some of those minoritized groups. And we've had multicultural standards, but those really are kind of overarching. We didn't necessarily have anything specific for specific groups of students or specific programs. And so I really am glad that we actually did that, because I think there was a change in the conversation about why we create standards. Because in the past, we talked about which standards are going to have the most applicability. And this was the first time where CAS, I think, began to talk about equity and realizing that there may not be a lot of Indigenous student programs in colleges and universities right now, but having a set of standards is important. not only to provide those those elements of framework for what that practice should be, but as I mentioned before, advocating for the importance of it. And so I think some of the folks who put those standards together said, now that we have these CAS standards that have been approved by all these organizations, we can now go say to other institutions, we should have that
Right.
office. We should have an Indigenous student programs because there are standards for that. And so I think that was one of the times that I think CAS was leading the way in terms of some organizational restructuring, in institutions across the nation by providing that set of standards. Now, we knew that we weren't going to make a ton of money in it. We're probably going to lose money on the development of that. But that wasn't the point of creating those standards. We want to be able to really raise up and address some inequities within higher education in general, and provide some tools to folks doing this work to advocate for resources for those offices. And so I think that's probably the most important one. And also remember, we spent some time as a council when I was president developing cross-functional standards.
Yes.
So this was a great idea by Rich Keeling, who was one of our public directors, public representatives at the time, saying, higher ed is changing. We're not in these little silos. And so there are some issues that transcend multiple areas, and we were lucky to have Pat Coretta, another long-standing member, pulled her out of retirement to help guide all that. And I think that's been a really benefit to the field, because it also helped the field think about moving out of our silos of functional areas and providing some structure about how do we address some of these bigger needs, like first-year students and well-being and some of those other issues. And so those are the kind of things that I remember from my time as president.
Now, being the president of this organization requires a great deal of dedication and commitment. What kept you going all those years?
Well, a couple of things. One, I thought the work was important, but the other thing is the people, the relationships. To be able to work with so many smart people and be able to learn from them was really was satisfying. And these are like the heavy hitters of higher ed. These are the people who are like big names in the field, and to be able to say like I worked with them or I collaborated with them, I think those are probably the other pieces. But so between knowing that the standards are important, trying to create resources to extend the use of the standards, and as you mentioned, helping people understand the multiple uses, and then providing the tools to actually use those, and the people, I think those are the main things.
Okay. So I recall during your presidency that you really shifted some focus within CAS and really pushed us into a deeper understanding and appreciation of assessment. Talk a little bit about what you did during your presidency to really underscore assessment, and how you brought in organizations like SAL, et cetera, to help us with those conversations.
Yeah. Well, I think I saw the opportunity to really extend some of our work, not within also only in student affairs, but beyond that. And I think the other issue was, CAS, their only revenue is from the products we sell. And so there was also a need for some more resources, either financial resources, technological resources, organizational resources, or maybe just human resources. So really building some of those partnerships with student affairs assessment leaders, the National Institute for Learning Outcomes Assessment, some for-profit companies like Weave and Sky Factor and Everfi that actually can help move our standards forward. And then also campus labs, that was really helpful. So not only did some of those organizations help amplify the work that they're doing, that actually increases some revenue. So when we collaborated with campus labs, where they took the CAS standards and built it into their assessment management system, so that people could actually, if they're already using the assessment management system, they could use those data for program assessment using the CAS standards. That was a financial benefit for CAS, but it also got the word out to a lot more people who might not have been aware of that. Same thing for the National Institute for Learning Outcomes Assessment. NILOA pretty much worked in that academic affairs area, the institutional assessment area. And so to bring them on, and at the time, Executive Director Natasha Jakowski, to have her validate CAS standards, that was really important. And then SAL was really important because they really are the student affairs assessment people.
Right.
There are some student affairs assessment people at ACPA, some in NASPA, but Sal brings them all together. And so that was a great opportunity to connect with Sal, not only to get the word out, but also get some really important feedback from folks who are actually using that and doing that work on the ground. And so I hope, my hope is that we kind of expanded the reach of CAS, but also leveraging some resources through those partnerships.
Well, they were great resources to bring to the table, and we are still benefiting from those relationships. So thank you for your leadership in that area. Are there other major accomplishments during your time on the council and specifically during your presidency that you like to lift up?
Well, I think, I think we really changed some things organizationally. We thought about project management, created spreadsheets to track the work that we did. We began actually assessing the work of CAS by
Right.
coming up with some metrics. We tried to improve the efficiency of our meetings by having the governing board members write reports ahead of time and not spending half the meeting just giving the report out. That provided the opportunity when we had that limited time synchronously to actually do the work and do some of that discussion, because we were really starting to ramp up a lot of stuff. So we didn't have as much time just to do here's what I'm working on, here's what I'm working on, when we could do that, send that ahead of time, people can read it, and then we really leverage the time in discussion and planning and problem solving. And one of the opportunities when we collaborate with IDEA, which now I think is owned by Anthology, they talked about marketing. So they actually connected us with a marketing firm to help us really professionalize how we sell our products. And I think that was really helpful. And then we began the conversation about how to move to a different model for directing the organization. Unfortunately, with the passing of Mary Beth Dressler Sharp, our first full-time executive director, we had to figure out, is that the model we want for the organization to move the organization forward? Fortunately, Deb Garrett, as past president, stepped in as the interim, but then Dan Bureau did a great job helping us think about association management of organizations. They're professional organizations that do this work. And so I think once we move to that model, I think that really helped the governing board focus on the CAS essential work, not the administrative work, because there was somebody else doing that. But I can't take credit for that. That conversation just happened while I was president. Dan Bureau did all of that. He really led that initiative. But I think those are some of the big things. And I think we also expanded some of the resources we created. We began talking about resource packs for faculty members so they could teach about it, resource packs for graduate students, both of which were free, because we wanted to make sure that new people coming in the field were aware of these. We talked about the customized SAGs, because some institutions want to take and pull from different things, or if they had a unit that had multiple functional areas, they want to be able to do an assessment of that unit, but pull a little bit from this functional area, pull a little bit from that functional area. We moved to an ebook for the standards to make that a little bit more accessible. And then we started talking about what I might call these ancillary or supplemental resources, like resource papers.
Right.
How might you use it? And as you mentioned, what are the multiple ways you can use CAS and the CAS standards? We brought in colleagues to write papers about how they were using that. And so I think those are some of the things that I'm really proud of that we did as an organization during the time as president. Now, I can't take credit for any or all of those, but those are some of the things that happened while I was president.
Well, actually, you can take credit for it, because good leaders allow for there to be productivity among all of the members of that organization. And so thank you again for that leadership. So as we close this interview, what is your hope for the future of CAS?
I think continue to do the work that they're doing, because I think it's essential. Sometimes I see these ebb and flows in terms of the field's recognition of CAS and how important it is. And so I hopefully CAS will continue to get the word out so that people can use those resources. I think one of the challenges that CAS has always had is that, they make their money from the products. That's how CAS does the work that they do. But CAS is also aware they want to make those products accessible to people, financially accessible to people. And so I think that's the ongoing tension, is how can CAS make money to continue the good work they're doing, but also get the resources in the hands of people who can use them. And so I think the more that CAS can think about that and provide maybe some of these other free resources beyond the standards to help get the word out and maybe kind of help people think about how important it is to use those and buy the standards, self-assessment guides, things like that. That's going to continue to demonstrate the importance of the CAS standards. And I think the more partnerships that CAS can develop, the better, because that leverages additional resources and helps amplify the good work of CAS.
Excellent. So is there anything else that you'd like to contribute that I should have asked that I didn't ask, or something you just want to share as for the good of the order as we close out?
Yeah. The only thing final thing I say is thank you. Being involved in CAS was a fantastic professional development opportunity to be able to lead an organization that's not just an individual organization, but a consortium.
Right.
You know, I had to develop some different leadership skills to do that. And the people I met and the people I continue to stay connected to it's lifelong friendships, not just colleagues. And so I really can't thank CAS enough for those opportunities.
Right. Well, again, Gavin, thank you for your leadership. And what has become my closing tagline with these conversations is thank you for receiving the baton of leadership from Deb Garrett and passing it on to Dan Bureau. We really appreciate that. Okay.
No, you're very welcome, Ralph. Thanks for the opportunity.
Take care. Bye. Bye-bye.